My name is Andre Toth. I was born in Milan, Italy in 1937. My parents were Hungarians. My father was Jewish. His name was Josef Kaufman, with two N's at the end. And my mother was not Jewish. I guess she was Christian. And they were dating, and my mother came from a long line of anti-Semitic people. And I suspect, although I'm not sure, they her family broke up the engagement. So my mom married the guy named Paul Toth, and my father, according to family lore, married quotation marks a rich widow. 6 months into the marriage, my mother's husband died, and so my father divorced his wife and married my mother, and they moved to Milan, Italy. This was in 1934, and that's where they lived until my father died in 1949 or 50. My mother and my father were always Mr. and Mrs. Kaufman, but I was always Andre Toth. Then at some point, my mother became Mrs. Toth, and that was after my father died. I have some papers from Milan, and it's very, very confusing. It's not correct. My father died in 1949, but he is not listed as my father. My mother's first husband is listed as having died in 1945, but in fact he died in 1934. I usually hung out grown-ups. I didn't have too many friends my age. My parents didn't pay too much attention to school, so 10 days before the end of this first semester, they would just come to pick me up and take me to, we used to go to San Remo, which is the Italian Riviera, for two weeks, and then I came back when school had started already. So I didn't have too many friends when I was a small child, but we did have a family who lived on the same floor we did. The daughter had a daughter, and her name was Anita, and she and I played as friends, and I still have pictures of us hanging out the backyard and in the house. But I didn't have that many friends until I became a teenager. When I was a child, I usually stayed home and read or played on a sidewalk with a couple of other kids. We used to go to Venice for the summer, and we used to stay at this hotel on the beach in Lido, not in Venice, but across the pond, which is called the Lido, which is a beach community. And we stayed at this hotel called Hotel de Ban, and we had a cabin. Everybody had a cabana. They had a shower and bathroom and all that. And at the entrance of the beach, there was a sign that said "No Jews or dogs allowed." But we went there anyway, and nobody asked us anything. And as I mentioned, the people who lived in the apartment across the hall from us in Milan were very sort of prominent fascists, and they knew my father was Jewish, and they came every Saturday night and play bridge and listen to the Vitrola. So Italians, until the Germans took over the transports, Italians never had the enthusiasm of killing Jews like other countries like Poland and Germany. So that I really did not encounter much anti-Semitism that I remember. In fact, I never have. I don't remember when it was that I found out that my father was Jewish. My mother never talked about it because Jews were not popular at that time. My parents, my mother, raised me as a Catholic, and she made me promise that I would always remain Catholic and that I would never talk about my father. So at some point, I knew my father was Jewish, but I don't remember when it was that I found out. I went to church and I had this thing called First Communion, and I have some pictures of it. And my father didn't belong to a synagogue. My mother just went to church with me for show. I just grew up as a Catholic, but not a particularly faithful one. The other thing that I remember is towards the end of the war, while I was playing on the sidewalk by myself, and my mother was watching me from the balcony, a column of German troops started coming down the street, and there was a long column, and my mother gestured to me to raise my hand in the Nazi salute, which I did, and at some point this motorcycle with a sidecar stopped in front of me, and one of the soldiers came out and patted me on the head and said with the kind of a broken or heavily accented Italian what a good boy I was. And at the same time there was a man who was walking across the street in the opposite direction of where the German was coming from, and he didn't stop and he didn't salute. So the same guy who patted me on the head crossed the street and beat him to a pulp. So I just remained there until the Germans were all gone, and then I went upstairs, and that was one of the closest experiences I've had, even though at the time I didn't think it was such a big deal. But I guess I must have been shaken. My father owned a textile factory which burned out because of one of the air raids from the Americans, and all the water mains were broken, and so he had to watch it burn down to the ground. After that, he had a toy export-import business where he imported and exported toys from all over the world. After the first bombardment of Milan, my parents sent me to a farm about an hour from Milan, and I stayed there for a few months. And my parents came to visit me on weekends or some other time, but I stayed there because the Americans were now bombing farms, and there weren't any Germans. So I don't really remember how long I stayed there, but I, I still remember uh, buckets of milk coming out with the were coming out of the barn, uh, held by burly guys, and the buckets of milk were full of dead flies. And till this day, I can't drink milk. I mean, I can have it on cereal, but I can't drink a glass of milk because I still have this vivid image of dead flies swimming in the milk. The other experience I had during the war was a Sunday afternoon, and I was at the movies with our housekeeper and her boyfriend. And when we came out, the sky was red because that was the first time the Americans had bombed Milan, and they bombed the periphery, the outskirts, because that's where all the factories were. Now he stayed in Milan throughout the war, but when the Germans took over the transports, the Holocaust transports to Auschwitz, he disappeared and he was gone for about a year, maybe less. We lived on a place called Via del Fascio, and the fascio is a symbol of fascism, and it's an axe with some flowers around it, and so in Italy, in other places too, the street signs are affixed to the buildings at the corner of the street, and and when the partisans came into Milan, that's one of the things that they did. They machine gunned the Via del Fascio sign, and it became Via Nerone, which is Nero Street. I lived on the street during the war, and at the end of the street there was this thing called the Palazzo Lita, and the Palazzo Lita was one of the headquarters of the Gestapo with the Hotel Regina, where they tortured partisans and Jews and people like that. When the Americans liberated Milan, after or before the partisans, I forgot which, they entered into the cathedral square coming, if you face the cathedral, they were coming in from the left. And my parents knew somebody who had an apartment facing the square. And so we were watching the Americans, and some Nazis or some fascists or some Germans started firing their guns from the right-hand side of the cathedral where the Archbishop of Milan lived, and so there was a total panic in the streets, and in fact, the balcony that I was on was divided by a gate, and the part of the balcony that I was on did not have a door, and in order to open the gate, I would have had to stand up. The bullets didn't come close to me or anything. In fact, I just heard noise, but I didn't see anything. And so finally, the Americans went up there to the Archbishop home, and they captured whoever was firing, and that was the end of that. Um, when he came back, uh, my mother told me, I don't remember, but when he came back, the first thing he did was he and a bunch of other people knocked down a wall that was on the side of my house that had a ramp into the basement. and out of the ramp, somebody drove his Alfa Romeo out, and this was a huge car that had 4 front seats and maybe like 6 back seats facing 3 and 3 facing each other. And he disappeared for a few days, and when he came back, my mother told me, his knuckles were all bloody, and apparently he and a bunch of other Jews and or Hungarians went around Milan and found collaborators, Germans, and beat him up or worse. Shortly after the war ended, one night he came home very, very upset, and my mother told me not to make any noise. In fact, they gave me a toy to play that was somewhat silent. And that's when he found out that his entire family, except for his sister Shari, had been taken to Auschwitz and killed in the last 4 or 5 months of the war. So somehow he got Shari out of Budapest, which is where she lived, and she moved in with us for a couple of years, maybe longer, maybe less, I don't remember. And then when she went back, because they had a lot of property outside of Budapest, her husband was the general manager of the Budapest Opera House, and so they had some money, I guess. But when she went back, the Iron Curtain happened, and so she was never able to get out, and at some point, I'm sure she died. He had a peptic ulcer, and somehow he became addicted to morphine, and ultimately he died of an overdose of morphine, though I don't know whether it was voluntary, was a suicide, or was just an accident. Well, I came to the States in 1956. I was very poor when the last 2 years that I was in Italy. I worked for a Jewish guy who owned the biggest music store in Milan. It was called the Messaggeria Musicale. I didn't come with my mother. My mother came later. I lived in New York for a while, and then I ran out of money. So I applied to a couple of universities, and I got into UB. I couldn't get my transcripts from high school in Italy, so I had to take the GED. And after I took the GED, I started night school, and then I got drafted, and then I was sent to Korean school, where I learned to speak Korean, and then I went to Korea, and I was an interpreter for the time that I was there, and I was attached to the first division, which is called the Big Red One. And then when I came out, I went back to college, and I got a BA in English literature, and then I taught for 4 months, and that's all I could do. That's all I could stand. I was asked not to come back, but I wasn't going to come back anyway. And so I went back to graduate school, and the School of Social Work in those days offered a program in community organization. So I have an MA in community organization, and my first job was to organize migrant workers in the southern tier. And then I worked for Model City, and then I went to Sisters Hospital, where I started. I really started the methadone clinic, which is still, I think it's still, well, I'm not sure that it's still there. And I was there for 9 years. And then during this time, I studied with Masters and Johnsons. I went back and forth between Buffalo and St. Louis until I became a sex therapist. And then I worked for a healthcare plan, full-time and then part-time. I taught human sexuality at the medical school, at the UB Medical School, and then I taught again human sexuality in at College H, which is we no longer exists, but this College H was on the North Campus and was the health allied sciences, and then I taught again human sexuality at the School of Social Work, and I taught sociology at Niagara Community College. Meanwhile, I started about 40 years ago, I started a private practice, primarily in sex therapy, but then it became sort of a generalist. I became a generalist, but I still specialize in couples therapy, and I see both heterosexual as well as gay couples. It was maybe in 1983. I was about 46. Well, it started with my reading Holocaust books, which I did for about 20 years. And I had an interest, and I can't explain why, but I just did. And so all my friends, some of my friends, knew that I had this interest in the Holocaust. So I had 3 friends who suggested, your father was a Jew, you're so interested in the Holocaust, why don't you become a full-time Jew? And so I thought, that sounds like a good idea. So I went to, it was called then Temple Beth Am on Sheridan, and I met with the Rabbi Mason, and I told him my story, and he said, well, if you want to become an official Jew, you can study with me for a year, and then I'll make you one. And so I studied with him for about a year and a half, and then he said, well, I think you're ready. And so we had a little ceremony, and I've been an official Jew ever since. But I always felt, not always, but ever since I grew up, I always felt Jewish. But it was never a big deal, because I'm not a religious Jew, even though I belong to a synagogue. But I just wanted, I wanted to be identified by others as a Jew. When I was in Italy, I was a Hungarian citizen, because even though you're born in Italy, if your parents are Hungarians, you're still Hungarian. So when I came to this country in 1956, I was a foreigner. And so I never felt completely part of the American experience. And then when I joined the temple, Beth Am and then Sinai, I could not share the enthusiasm that everybody seemed to have. They're all jumping and down and singing all kinds of happy songs, and I could fake it, but after a while I didn't want to do that anymore, and so I just felt sort of going to temple, which is something that I still do, makes me feel alienated because I don't feel part of it. But I'm a card-carrying Jew, so I should feel part of it. But I don't feel part of anything. Well, I thought about this a couple of years ago, and the question of why I became a Jew, a full-time Jew, has is not related to searching for an identity as much as it has to do with anger. Anger is a primary motivator in my life. And I was just thinking about this the other day, that when I read and when I read Holocaust books, and I read about Nazis who did horrible things, I always write their names down, and then I look up to see what happened to them. And when they died in nursing homes, I sort of I feel bad. And when they died hanging, I feel good. And when they died in jail, I feel equally good. So, it's not so much a search for identity. And if it is, it's not a conscious kind of thing where I said to myself, oh, I think I have to have an identity, so I might as well be Jewish. It's just more to do with the resentment that I have for having denied who I was all those years, and some way towards my mother, even though I understand intellectually why she complained about my friends being too Jewish. My mother was an interesting person. I mean, you could be somewhat anti-Semitic and still married to a Jew. And my mother is a great example of it. She was not anti-Semitic, but she was sort of patronizing against the Jews. She would say, he's Jewish. Or even though her friends, her Hungarian friends in Milan, many of them, her best friends, were Hungarian Jews. And so I think that her anti-Semitism, however much there was of it, came from her family. But the fact that she married a Jew, coming from an anti-Semitic family, says something about her. I don't know exactly what, but I guess maybe it says that when you love somebody, you overcome your prejudices. Maybe. The reason we should remember the Holocaust is, as we are told, so that it will not happen again. However, obviously, remembering the Holocaust hasn't stopped many Holocausts to happen since then. So remembering the Holocaust may be something that we should do out of a moral obligation, without the hope that somehow by remembering and by acting out our recollections, somehow it will have any effect on preventing repetition of it. The answer is really a cliche. There are good people and bad people. And what determines good people from bad people is a matter of opinions, unless they're really, really bad, or unless they're really, really good.